I'm James Miller. Welcome to Critical Thinking. In this course, we'll look at the history of philosophy and the development of reason. We'll look at the foundations set by the rationalists and the empiricists, and we'll study the relationship between faith and science. We'll talk about the work of the Holy Spirit and also develop some critical, skeptical tools that will allow us to identify common fallacies. The goal, by the time we're done, is that we would be able to analyze big ideas critically and come up with some of our own. Glad you're with me. Let's get started. This is the moral argument for the existence of God. The moral argument does not prove that God exists. Rather, it argues that if a certain thing exists, then God must exist as well. There's a thing whose existence is fundamentally dependent on a divine being, and that thing is objective moral values. Objective moral values are values that are true regardless of whether or not anyone believes in them. This is in contrast to a subjective moral value, a value that depends on my opinion or your opinion. For instance, I believe that torturing a child for fun is wrong in all contexts, no matter what. It doesn't matter who disagrees with me or who believes that it's a good idea or what compromise is being made to allow for it. I think it's wrong in every context, and that means I hold an objective moral value. I don't believe it depends on my opinion, nor on the opinion of anyone else. If I cease to exist and the whole world were somehow convinced that this evil idea were good, it would still be evil. That's an objective moral value. Now, some people argue that objective moral values do not exist. They argue that all ethical values are a matter of opinion, subjectivity, intuition, or emotion. Some argue that moral values are simply a product of a social contract. I agree not to wrong you if you agree not to wrong me. And through the long baking process of history, those ideas become hardened into inviolable truths that we now hold to be somehow permanent or divine. But it all boils down to a social contract people have agreed to follow in order to live together in the same world. The problem with people who commit to a subjective view of morality is that at the end of the day, they have real trouble defending it. I've asked people who claim that all moral values are subjective. So you're saying to me that torturing a child for fun is not always wrong. It's not wrong in every context. It's not fundamentally wrong. They usually go silent on this argument or try to construct an argument that says, well, fundamentally, all human biology depends on a contract in which things like that are wrong, so it is wrong, just not in the definitive way that you're fishing for. At the end of the day, people who hold to subjective moral values still tend to feel a little queasy about the implications. I find that even people who are atheists try to defend the idea of objective moral values. Michael Ruse, a philosopher in the state of Florida, is an atheist, and he holds to the idea of objective moral values. David Enoch, a professor at the Hebrew University, has argued that morality somehow objectively supervenes on pleasure and evil supervenes on pain, and the avoidance of all pain is the source of ethical values. Thus, ethical values are fundamentally objective because pain is objectively bad. You can't define pain in any way other than to say it's that thing that's hurting. Pain is what it is, and so it is bad of necessity. And all moral value, he says, boils down to that. It's objective, but it doesn't require a God. Well, again, it's hard to account for why that's the case. If there is no God, pain and pleasure itself are accidents. They've evolved out of primordial ooze for no particular reason other than survival, which itself is not valuable. If all life has come to be without the existence of God, originally there was nothing anywhere in the universe. The universe burst into existence and somehow formed into planets that gave birth to life. At least this one did. And that life somehow developed consciousness, and in the process of developing consciousness, got a sense for pain and pleasure. But at the end of the day, we're just highly evolved primordial mud puddles. The fact that we've learned how to do sophisticated things like think and talk and see and communicate, all of that is just peripheral to the fact that we have no more value than the mud puddles we came from. Many years ago, I tried to illustrate this to a Sunday school class at church. The students showed up to church on a Sunday morning dressed in their finest clothes, and I took them out on the lawn in front of the church where I had made a giant mud puddle with a garden hose. I told them, go ahead and walk through the mud puddle as we talk. And they did, happily. I told them, look, if there is no God, you came from the mud. This mud that you're marching through has no value. You can walk all over it and treat it like an object because it is an object. When you die, you'll return to the mud. You'll just dissolve back into the universe, and eventually the universe will die a heat death and come to nothing. Your birth was an accident, and your death will be an accident. And everything in between those is just another accident called life. But life itself has no more value. It's just highly evolved primordial ooze, which will eventually disintegrate back into ooze again. So if, in this life, anyone gets in your way, you should feel free to march right over them like you're marching through this mud puddle. They have no more value than it does, because there's nothing to give it value. To the contrary, if there is a God, we have a good foundation for moral values. If there is a God, you were created with a purpose. God brought you into existence for certain reasons and not for other reasons. And fulfilling your purpose is satisfying your design. It's exactly like a hammer that's designed for the purpose of driving a nail. If you use a hammer to whack somebody over the head, you're not using for its intended purpose. But if you use it to drive a nail, you are. In the same way, God brought you into existence with a purpose. And when you fulfill that purpose, you satisfy your design. This design, this fulfillment of the design, is held accountable at the end of all time when we stand in front of God and give an account of our lives. God will look at us to see if we fulfilled our design, if we did what we were supposed to do. In the end, we face judgment, which will determine whether or not we lived rightly. When there's a God, we have an origin story and we have a destination. We have a place that we came from and we have a place that we're going to. The value of our lives can be measured in the fulfillment of our origin and the ultimate judgment at our destination. That gives us a grounding for objective value. Something bigger than ourselves has made us exist for a reason. Mud has no reason. Mud is an accident. There was accidentally a big bang that accidentally led to evolution, that accidentally led to mud somewhere along the way, and that mud began to breathe. But that breath has no more value than the mud or the cold planets hurtling through space. The moral argument for God's existence goes this way. If you believe in objective moral values must have a foundation. Without God, there is no feasible foundation for objective moral values. But with God, there is a feasible foundation for moral values. So God gives us grounding for the belief that objective moral values exist. Now we should be clear to say, we're not saying that atheists cannot behave morally. Of course they can. Many of them do. Many atheists have strict moral values that they hold to. Sometimes they advocate for justice in the public sphere because they feel so impassioned by it. But at the end of the day, they don't have an objective grounding for their beliefs in justice or goodness or whatever they stand for. In the end, they feel satisfied by the pursuit of that goodness. But that feeling of satisfaction is not grounded in objective truth. They weren't made to do that. They're not headed to a place where they're held accountable for it. And ultimately, the fight for justice in a godless world seems a little bit silly. It's kind of like an airplane that's in a nosedive headed towards a crash. And yet a steward is still walking up and down the aisle, serving beverages to whoever would like one. It's clear the plane's going to come to nothing. Serving drinks along the way is just a pleasantry. And in the same way, atheists who advocate strongly for moral values seem to be just making life a little more comfortable or satisfying or give it the feel of meaning when in fact it's all in a nosedive anyway. So at the end of the day, the moral argument for God's existence is one that grounds a belief that most of us hold to and a source that it reasonably could have come from. And without God, it's very hard to account for why so many of us believe that there is objective right and wrong. That's the moral argument for the existence of God.